Well, the math is the following, right? So Heidenheim on 22 points. Heidenheim occupy the promotion relegation spot. So you're not completely relegated. If they pass you. But 7 games left, they could finish the season with 43 points if they win their final 7 games, right?
Mhm.
So that is the current marker, I guess. Then there's Bochum with 20, so that is the first full relegation spot. So they could still reach 41 points. And then Kiel is on 17, so they could reach the full 38 and that's if they win all their remaining games, and that is how likely is that, you know.
Sure.
So let's say they each win maybe half of those games, which I think is probably a more realistic number. Um, then Heidenheim could maybe add another 9 to 10 points as a max, or expected, and that gets you at 32, 34, right? So that kind of shows you where you need to be, if you want to avoid relegation, I think. And I mean that is really the next question, and the next game that we wanted to get into is that Heidenheim, the Heidenheim game against Bayer Leverkusen. I mean, interestingly enough, last week, Stefan and I, when we did the previous show, we also kind of kind of looked at the Leverkusen games through the eyes of the relegation battle, because last week, Leverkusen were playing Bochum, and Bochum were this team, as you mentioned, under hacking and in the ascendancy. They would end up losing this game to Leverkusen 3-1. But they made this a match. I
Mm.
think, and we saw midweek, and if you're interested in what happened to Leverkusen against Bielefeld, Sepp and I broke that all down in one of the bonus shows. But you know, there is still a little bit of vulnerability in this Leverkusen side. You do get the sense that they now want to push that they exit in the Pokal means this is the only title left that they can sort of win. It's 6 points to Bayern Munich. We get to the Bayern Munich game as well, but this week Bayern Munich are going to set the table right on the Friday match, and then
Mhm.
Leverkusen gets to respond. Last week it was the other way around. Um, but this Heidenheim team too, and you mentioned it, they're now out of Europe. And I think that was probably Frank Schmidt's biggest problem this season, having to juggle this UEFA Conference League with Bundesliga games. They started really well. We all talked about young Wanner and the impact that he had on this team, and he was close to a call up to the German national team, and there is still that discussion whether he's going to represent Austria or Germany. And but he was in that conversation already. He's still firmly embedded in the U21, and I think we can all see his talent and his development and everything. But remember, there was a time where we were like, oh, Heidenheim, they're going to do this all again, and then they got hit by this full slate of playing in Europe,
Yeah.
and their results just drop, and now they're out, right? And they've just gotten better. They beat Wolfsburg last week, 1-0. They beat Kiel the week before that, um, 1-1 against Hoffenheim the week before that. So, all of a sudden, we were looking at a Heidenheim team that has been undefeated in 4 games, and now in the promotion relegation spot. They are only 3 points behind St. Pauli, who are also, I actually probably also going to keep pushing. They're just the 5 points behind Hoffenheim. And even if they would end up in that promotion relegation spot, I don't know if I would be too concerned about them. Let's say they play Kaiserslautern or Paderborn or someone like that. I think they would make a really good match out of that. So
Mm.
this Heidenheim team, long story short, could really push Leverkusen on the weekend.
Yeah, they're really good at home. They beat Bayern at home last year.
Mhm.
I think that the you hit the nail on the head with the European aspect. It's just that
Yeah.
for this is a really small club from a small town. They've done incredibly well to build up, go up through the divisions, get up to the
Mhm.
top through Frank Schmidt, who took over 16 years ago and who used to play for the club and who loves living there and will never leave. And it's such a
Mhm.
great story. They did lose some good players last year, um, and it kind of I guess there was a feeling there that because they lost Kleindienst, they lost Bester,
Mhm.
and another who returned to Freiburg, who I can't think of his name right now, but they these
Dingshi.
Dingshi, exactly.
Yeah.
And so you had these. You thought, okay, this is each of well, at least Kleindienst and Bester have been called up for Germany since then. So it's a pretty impressive that they were guys that no one had heard much of in the lower leagues. But I think more so than losing those players who are very, very talented, you've got a guy like Frank Schmidt who does wonders with that team, and now he's got midweek training sessions where he can work with them. They're playing Thursday night football in all over Europe, wherever the conference league is played. They're coming back in at all hours, and that's hard for any team for any team to be playing in Europe. But for a team with those resources and who's never really done that before, qualifying for the top for the well qualifying for Europe for the conference league in their first season in the top grade.
Yeah.
Um, so now they have one game a week for the remainder of the season. There's a few winnable games there. There's one game at Union in the final weeks, which will be crucial. Um, they could do something, but as you mentioned, if things stay the way they are, and if they're in the relegation playoff spot, then we know that for the last decade, the gulf between the Bundesliga and the Bundesliga 2
Yeah.
is so big that we've had, I think in the last decade, there's been one club who's come up from the second division from that
Union.
spot. That was Union, who they only did that on away goals
Yeah.
against Stuttgart. So that's so rare. Last year we had Dusseldorf 3 goals up, and we thought, okay, that's a done deal. We were already writing our stories about Fortuna for Allah,
Yeah. We
the
were.
free tickets for the that was the driving force getting them up there. Kevin Sturger decides to go mental and have an incredible game. Bochum score three and stay up in that playoff. So it's the level and quality is so different. I mean, the people who criticize this fixture, that's their main argument in saying
Mhm.
that it's so hard for those lower clubs to make it up.
Yeah.
So even a club like a Hamburg, as we've seen, like a Kaiserslautern, like a Cologne, these are clubs who have top division pedigree coming up against Heidenheim, who are a Bundesliga club, have been a Bundesliga club for 2 years. That'll be a challenge for them. So I really think, yeah, if you can at least get above those bottom two relegation spots, you'll have a good chance to stay up. And the biggest thing for Heidenheim is they're not playing every 3 days anymore.
Yeah, no, I think that is a big thing. And it's actually really interesting when you look at their schedule. I mean, obviously they have Leverkusen this weekend, right? Then they have Frankfurt. That's going to be hard. Although Frankfurt are still in that Europe, they're still in that weird balancing act between Europe and the Bundesliga. And we all know Frankfurt's story. They have Tottenham, right? And that is a winnable fixture for Frankfurt. I'm not saying they're going to win it for sure, but it is one where they could come out at the other end and advance.
Yeah.
And so, they might be still preoccupied with both. And we know Frankfurt are really good in Europe. They represent the Bundesliga very well, especially the Europa League. They've won it a few years ago, reached the semi-final a couple years before that. So, this is a competition that they do take serious and they get a
Mhm.
lot of money from it. I did a story this for the Substack on Thursday, looking what it would mean for Bielefeld if they reach the Europa League, right? And Frankfurt, just from the league stage, so not even including the knockout stages, made 25 million euros just from
Yeah.
playing in the
Wow.
league stage. So that's
Wow.
a lot of money, right? So and that's why they take it so serious. So they probably be still really much in the middle of that. So they get Frankfurt and then Munich at home. So interesting. They get both the title teams, like the teams fighting for the title. So they can be a decisive factor on that. Then Stuttgart away, which now that Stuttgart have sort of lifted off and reached the final in Berlin, what state are they going to be in? That's going to be really interesting. And then it gets into what you mentioned, Bochum, Union, Bremen. And Bremen are probably going to be not fighting for anything at this stage of the season. They're going to be in no man's land, not really worried about anything. But those are the three games that I think will decide where Heidenheim are at. But at the same time, as I mentioned, they can also make a difference here in this title race. First Leverkusen and Munich, and you mentioned it last year. They did beat Munich at home in Heidenheim.
Yeah. Yeah. That was such a massive fixture with, I think, 2 goals in 2 minutes and Kleindienst
Hmm.
scoring in front of the home fans. And so that was that was the moment when we knew Bayern's race had been won. I don't think it was mathematical yet, but it
Yeah,
was close to it. Um, and Heidenheim can do that. They're strong at home. That's it's such a beautiful little stadium there in the middle of a beautiful little town, and yeah, it's that's I think as well. I mean, Leverkusen should learn their lesson from midweek.
yeah,
That it's not a foregone conclusion that they're going to go through against Heidenheim the same way that they won't go through against. They didn't go through against Bielefeld on the weekend. They've said a few times. They said it in reference to the Champions League and in reference to the Bundesliga that we want to keep this going so that when Florian Wirtz comes back, we've got something to fight for. And
yeah.
so I think that's this week, whether you consider it an advantage or disadvantage going first or second. I mean,
Definitely.
um, Bayern will be going first. Bayern really, really undermanned, against Augsburg. Leverkusen had the chance to strike back. It'll be a bit of a mental battle. The weeks are frittering away. We're losing weeks and it's staying at 6 points. So the likelihood's getting less and less. But Leverkusen, the task is simple. They have to get through against what's going to be a tough looking Heidenheim on Saturday.
I mean, we had it a few times this season already where Bayern Munich, the result against Bochum comes to mind, and then Leverkusen, for lack of better terms, shit the bed against Bremen, right? So,
Yeah, 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 for
so
sure. I mean that's the match where you think, okay, Bremen were in such a bad state.
yeah,
Um, you got to get something, even a point, and it
mhm,
was only Leverkusen's second loss in the league in the last 2 years, basically 18 months.
yeah,
So such a crucial game, but that was either they had the matches with Bayern either side, lost Florian Wirtz, like for Florian Wirtz. That game is going to be looked back on as a hugely pivotal match in the
yeah.
scope of the season, for Leverkusen. So it'll be huge.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it's going. This is it, and I'm really curious to see too how Leverkusen are going to respond to what happened in Bielefeld because I talked about this with Sepp. It wasn't like that Bielefeld were lucky in that match. Leverkusen scored that early goal against through Jonathan Tah, and then they just stopped playing. They just
Yeah.
stopped playing football. They thought they had this one. And it was a very, I actually thought, now looking back, and when you do the immediate reaction part, you kind of react to the moment, and then you have a few days to sit on it, right? And I'm like, that was a very arrogant performance. It
Mm.
wasn't just, a lackluster performance or that this was like, oh, like they outplayed us, they outworked us, but it was, now that I'm looking back and the way that they behaved on the pitch, I think the biggest issue here was they scored that early goal and Jonathan Tah like celebrates it like it's the Bundesliga title. And then they were, oh yeah, like this is Bielefeld, whatever, we're gonna win this game.
Mm.
And Bielefeld were like, oh, we've done this three times before to other Bundesliga teams. Like, who cares?
Yeah.
And they played them off the pitch. It wasn't oh, we scored two goals and then sat back. No, that's just not what happened. And I think that it's a really good lesson for this game because like I think Leverkusen are finding out that they can't be arrogant against low teams that are perceived below them, right? And maybe that's something from what happened from last year where they were the invincibles and they would always be able to come back or whatever, but they just don't have that aura on them. And yes, they did it against Stuttgart where they came back. I was in that at that game, right, where they had this enormous comeback. But you can't just assume because it happened once that you can do this over and over again. And I think that is probably the biggest danger for them in this fixture.
Yeah, this happened so often this year that they've taken the
Yeah,
lead, sometimes 2 goals up, and then they've dropped points. I think there was at some point they dropped 15 points. That was a few weeks ago, so I haven't updated statistics on that. But they seem to. I still think when they look their absolute best this season, and that's with Florian Wirtz, I still think they look better than any other team in Germany, better than the best of
agree.
Bayern.
Yeah.
But the problem is they play like that for 15, 20 minutes, and then they
Hmm.
seem to really drop the intensity. And it's happened. There was a run of it happening when they drew with Bochum at home and they drew with Bremen earlier in the season, where they were every time they were 1 or 2 goals up, and you just thought, all right, this will be the kind of thing where they uh, they they get well ahead on the scoreboard, then they close it out in a very Xabi Alonso controlled style, and they just had these defensive fade outs. and quite often it's happened immediately after scoring a goal, which is what happened on Tuesday night. Yeah, I mean the for them the task is simple. They have to keep winning. I think they probably were pretty shocked by Tuesday night. I think most people were. It
Hmm.
seemed to be there's been these uh, for these lower division clubs in the DFB Pokal over the last few years, the semi-finals has really been the ceiling for them.
Yeah.
You had Saarbrücken last year, and they were clearly not up to that level. Then a few years before, you had Kiel playing against Dortmund. I think it was a 5-0, and it just seemed to be one of those things where this club had run on these lower division clubs had run on momentum um, and spirit, but then they get to face a bigger club and they flame out, which is I think what a lot of people thought was what I thought would happen on
Yeah.
Tuesday against
Me
Leverkusen.
too. Yeah.
Looking ahead at the fixtures, back when Florian Wirtz was injured, that was the one where you thought, okay, well, they should be fine to get to the final, but it didn't work out. So yeah, the task is simple. They have to get past Heidenheim on Saturday.